Okay, welcome to People and Their Poems podcast. I'm here today with Donna Marie Merritt of Watertown. She is a poet and children's author, and she's here today to talk about her craft with us. Welcome, Donna Marie.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And thank you so much for joining us on this hot summer day. Really do appreciate your time. Donna Marie, would you introduce yourself to our audience? Describe yourself as a writer. What kind of a writer are you? Who's your audience, and what kinds of writings have you done over the years?
So really my audience is from 4 to 64 and beyond. I write for all ages. I've written for magazines such as Hello, which is Hello is part of Highlights, and it's for 2-year-olds. And then I've written poetry for adults. So I've written for all ages, and I think I describe myself mostly as accessible. I think whatever you're reading of mine, you can understand. I think some people look at poetry and think it is obscure and they're not going to understand it. And that may have been the way it was when you were in school, but it's not the way it is in general anymore. And so I like people to think that when they read my work, they're going to understand it and get something from it.
What got you started as a writer? How long have you been at this craft?
Long time. I think I wrote my first poem when I was 8. And I discovered my first poetry anthology when I was about 10 or 11. And it was by Lee Bennett Hopkins. He's the one who compiled it. And it was called Potato Chips and a Slice of Moon. And I still remember the title. I remember it had a blue cover. I think it was like the night sky. And I just remember falling in love with poetry then through that book.
Wow. And what was your first poem like? Do you remember?
The one that I wrote?
Yeah.
It was bad. I remember that. I think I was sitting in my aunt's room and looking around, and she had a Monkees poster, the Monkees musical group, on the wall, and I was trying to rhyme things with that. I think I was just looking around the room and rhyming things.
That's fun. Yeah, I remember being in high school, and a friend gave me a Robert Frost collection with a hardcover and a paper dust jacket, and I felt very important to have this poem by this once poet laureate. And rhyme was the thing once upon a time. I think it's kind of gone out of style lately, but it was jamming the sentiment around the rhyme was something I remember very, very well.
Yeah, and I think there's a mix though. I write mostly in free verse, but I do write some very organized poems with specific rhyme schemes also. So I don't think it's totally gone.
Yeah, well, that's good. It's a good discipline, and it makes us pay attention to the language too, And who was your first audience when you wrote that poem?
Oh, probably my aunt, my grandmother, my mother.
Yeah, were they receptive?
They were, and they were always encouraging.
Yeah, I had the same experience in my family. I look back at some of the stuff. I find it in the box of papers my folks kept in the safe, and I think, and it's a gift they give us, isn't it? The acceptance and the
Absolutely.
Can you tell us about the poem or the song lyric that brought you to poetry? Can you tell us a little bit more about that first poem?
The book, Potato Chips and a Slice of Moon, is long gone. However, I do have one of Lee Bennett Hopkins' books with me. And so I'd like to read 2 poems from that, if I may, because these speak to me, and I think maybe they'll speak to other people too. The first one is called Grades. K through 3 in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Grade 4 in faraway Newark, New Jersey. Grade 5, another school, another teacher, another new face. Grade 6 in some other new part of another Newark place. One thing I learned from all of these schools is that I am someone who will make my own rules. And that spoke to me because, like Lee Bennett Hopkins, I moved a lot around as a kid. And so I didn't go to kindergarten, but I started first grade in one school. And by the time I got to 4th grade, I'd been in 6 different schools in different states.
Oh, wow.
So I think that's one thing that poetry does for us is we read something and we say, hey, I've experienced that. Somebody else knows how I feel. And the second poem from this book: "What you want to be when you grow up?" asked my teacher, Miss Ethel K. Tway. Down the rows the kids called out: a cop, a nurse, a soldier, a sailor, a scientist, butcher, a firefighter. When she got to me, I said, a writer. Lewis laughed hysterically. A writer, he said. What a crazy thing to want to be. I don't think that's funny, Lewis, said Miss Tway. Everyone's entitled to sound their own voice. Becoming a writer is a fine life choice. That special moment on that red letter day, I fell madly in love with Miss Ethel K. Tway. And that's just a shout out to all the teachers and mentors and adults who encourage children to be whatever they want to be. And as long as you put in the work, you can do it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I remember those moments, like, what do you want to be? And the other question was, what do your parents do? And there were the doctors and the lawyers and among the parents when I was a little kid. And my dad was a telephone man. He was an installer and he climbed telephone poles. And, I had the chauvinism of a small child, like, you guys ain't nothing without my dad,
Right.
And it's just really interesting hearing you read that poem and thinking about the influence of adults and their questions and how we perceive ourselves and what's possible, and the importance of really moderating those conversations among kids about what they say, because you're so vulnerable when you put that out there.
Oh, absolutely. And while Lee Bennett Hopkins had that experience, I did not as a child. Nobody told me that I could be a writer when I was an adult. And it wasn't until my mother was a stay-at-home mom, my father fixed copy machines, and it wasn't until I got to college and a professor took me aside and he said, you could do this for a living. And he was the first person who had ever told me that. And I wish I'd heard it at a much younger age.
That's interesting. The other day I heard from a college professor from Western Connecticut State University, and she is a joyful person. Just Judy Sullivan loves literature, loves students, and the joy of literature and language and the interactions we can have based on literature was her great gift to us, in addition to great insights, and she had a very wry sense of humor. It's powerful. I mean, those poems speak to the community of words and what happens when we engage them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So those were the two poems you wanted to share with us from
Yes.
Lee Hopkins. Okay. All righty. Do you think that those poems have influenced your writing in any particular way in terms of content, or the empowerment, the sense that, yes, I can do this and I can be my own person?
Yeah, I think it's a combination, but more, the empowerment that, because as writers, we often doubt ourselves because we're working in isolation most of the time. And we don't know until it's published, if it's ever published, how someone's going to react to it. So I think just knowing, believing in yourself, that's the power of that poem, that you can do it. But also at the same time, that poem never mentions fame and glory and money, which is not why you get into writing poetry.
Right, right. Can you talk a little bit about your own canon of work, particularly your poetry? What kinds of topics have you undertaken as a poet to explore and to write about?
So I started, well, like I said, I wrote my first poem when I was young, but then during my teenage years, I'm writing awful, awful poems about heartache and, things that I would never show anybody now. But, you're just pouring your heart out, but it's for yourself. And it wasn't until I think it was 2009, I was working as an editor, and it was the height of the recession, and I lost my editing job. And I started just writing poems about how that felt. I felt betrayed. I was worried about money. And I just started writing for myself. But then a publisher that I spoke with said that might speak to other people who are in the same position. So my first book was Job Loss, A Journey in Poetry. So it really was me just, talking about my own personal experiences. And then hopefully this book helped some other people. But 2 months after I was laid off, my husband was diagnosed with an aggressive cancer.
Oh boy.
And it's a second marriage for both of us. We'd only been married a couple of years. He's fine. He's 11 years cancer free. But again, I started writing, and that second book became Cancer Caregiver's View. And this is one that I heard from most people about, because when I was writing it, I didn't know the outcome. I was writing it each day, and I didn't know if he would survive. So people have read this book say, somebody finally understands what I was going through. So a lot of my work is personal like that. The third book in that series was What's Wrong with Ordinary? Poems to Celebrate Life, because there's nothing wrong with ordinary after losing your job and your husband goes through cancer. Ordinary is great. I even celebrate menopause in this. I celebrated everything. And then after that, when things settled down, I started writing more nature poems, personal observations. So some of my other books are more to do with things that I see in Connecticut or up at the Cape, where we go once a year. This one I will show because the cover is by Wendell Miner, who is a Connecticut artist. He's written and illustrated many children's books and done covers for many people. So the first 3 books were more based on personal experience, but after that I was able just to kind of sit back and base it more on personal observation of other people, not just my own experiences.
I'm sure all those struggles that you documented through your poetry in those earlier collections gave you that grounding and that insight and that rich soil to draw from to grow these new poems that were observations about what's going on in nature poetry and such.
They did. And I think everything that we write and everything we experience prepares us for something else. I think, some people worry about wasting time doing this or that. I don't think we ever waste time. I think everything prepares us for the next part of our journey.
Absolutely. Could you do us a favor, Donna Marie? Could you just kind of read your titles for the benefit of the podcast audience who won't see the video, so they can hear the richness of those other titles?
Oh, sure. So I told you the first 3, right? And there was No Winter Maintenance, Pass at Your Own Risk, which is a sign that if you live in Connecticut, you've seen that sign, because there are some roads that are not plowed during the winter. So that's the title poem in there. Her House and Other Poems, that was the one that the cover was illustrated by Wendell Miner. So if you don't like the poems, you cut off the cover, you frame it, and you're good. And then We Walk Together is a chapbook, and this was about looking at the world through the eyes of other people. Mm-hmm. And this one came about because I was on my way home from a poetry reading, and there was a man who had a sign that said, "We'll work for food." And it seemed like I was in a safe spot, so I pulled over and I asked him if he would like a poetry book, and his eyes lit up. And I think it was just because I saw him as a person. And I gave him a book and I tucked a little money in the back of it, but he put the sign down and I watched him walk away reading that book and just absorbed in it. And so that chapbook is based on people like that. I wrote about the homeless, the addicted, kids who have trouble in school. So that's We Walk Together. And then my newest one is Bible Poems for Reflection and Response.
Oh, can you tell us a little bit about that one? Is it interactive in some way?
It's interactive in that it has blank pages interspersed, and it also has wide margins, so that we encourage people to write their own poems in there, or to draw a picture, or slip a photograph, or write a prayer. So it is meant to be a conversation between the reader and God. You don't have to use it that way, but the publisher deliberately left space for that.
That's incredible. And I just think that the experience of that homeless person that you recognize as a human being, and the intellectual, emotional, and spiritual hunger that accompanies that homelessness, that isolation, is really, really powerful and provocative. I think that image will stay with me for a good long while. Can you tell us where are your books available to read, to borrow, or Is that most recent one available online or in bookstores or through some other means?
So if you are local to Connecticut, Bible Poems for Reflection and Response is available at Hickory Stick in Washington Depot and at Bird's Books in Bethel, Connecticut.
Right.
Also, there are a few
Two
local
wonderful bookstores.
Oh, they're marvelous. They really are, both of them. And uh, Bird's Books is newer. I forget how long they've been here for a while now, but Hickory Stick has been here over 65 years, and they're still going strong despite places like Amazon. So, and I always encourage people to go to your local bookstore, and you can look up my work and ask your own bookstore to carry it instead of going through Amazon. I know Amazon is easier, it's more convenient, and sometimes it's cheaper, but really you are supporting your local artists and your local bookstores and your local merchants if you go through them.
And you know what the other good thing about Hickory Stick is? They are absolutely delightful people on the phone. It's in your hands within days. And once you get that book, you can go around the corner to Marty's and get a really awesome cup of coffee. Those first pages. Washington Depot is paradise.
It really is.
Good hiking, good books, you know. So that's really good to know. And they're available online if you're not in Connecticut.
Yes. Yes. So yeah, both Bird's Books and for Hickory Stick, you can order online.
That's great. And could I just ask, I'm looking at the image behind you, that little drawing that looks like a mouse. Mouse.
Yeah, this is an original by Ed Heck. He is a pop artist out of New York City, and he was the illustrator for one of my children's books, which is Teensy Meensy Mice. So these are the mice that appear in there, and he gave me an original painting to celebrate.
That's lovely. And are those books available as well these days?
Well, most of my children's books are out of print. Hickory Stick may have some Teensy Meensy Mice. They may also have Hush That Hullabaloo, which is a children's book set in Scotland. So they might have that one also. But other than that, unfortunately, unless you're big and famous, books don't stay in print that long these days.
But we'll go on a treasure hunt. We'll find them.
All right.
Could at this point, could you read us one of your poems so we could get hear your voice and your craft?
Sure, and I'll read from Bible Poems. It's a really short poem. It is called Rest, and it's based on Psalm 4, verse 9. I toss, turn at night, restless with worry, trying to hurry the first morning light. Would it not be sweet if I could let go, if I could just know God sleeps at my feet? And I wrote that one because I'm guilty of that. I worry constantly, even though I know it does nothing for anybody. So I try to remind other people and remind myself that it's, if you can just let go of it, and give it to the better hands, you'll be okay.
That's very beautiful. And I hear what you said about your poetry at the beginning of this conversation, that it's accessible, it's not obscure, and it's about the life we live, really, and just finding the peace and the beauty in the moment. And you conjure some very beautiful images. Thank you so much for that. Donna Maria, do you have any websites or places where people can find out more about you and your work online? I know from my own exploration of your titles that I have found that you make very good use of online resources to make your books available. Can you just talk to us a little bit about that before we close our conversation?
My website is donnamariebooks.com, and I think it's important for any artist to have a web presence these days, because that's the first thing I do. If I'm looking up a new book or a business or anything, I go right to the website. I want to find more about the writer or about the person behind a business. So I think it's important for all writers to do that. It's not something I'm that comfortable with, marketing my own things, and a lot of writers are not comfortable, but it's something we have to do these days. So social media, you also need to be a part of. I would recommend, I think people try to be everywhere on social media. I would pick one thing that you're comfortable with. I am comfortable with Facebook, so that's where I put things about myself or about my work. If you're reaching a younger audience, I would go with TikTok or Instagram there, and then that in between audience is probably Twitter. But wherever you're comfortable, I think that you need some kind of website and some kind of social media presence.
Got it. Thank you. And thank you for your presence in this conversation today. And thank you for joining us at People and Their Poems podcast that we spoke today with Donna Marie Merritt. That's Merritt, poet and children's author from Watertown, Connecticut. Thank you very, very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Sandy.